Welcome to our study on the book of Psalms. I know it's been some time since I made a video on the Psalms, so I'm going to bring you up to date now. First of all, I've been out of the country. I was in the Philippines for nearly 3 weeks doing some missions work and was not able to do any videos at that time. And I got back and catching up, and so now I'm trying to get back to our videos on Psalms. And for you that are following along, we're in Psalm 2 this morning. So let me just remind you some things about this. We're trying to just go through the book of Psalms. How long that's going to take, I don't know. We'll take the psalm at a time and just look at it and ask the Lord to speak to our hearts. And if you're interested in it, I have 3 volumes on the book of Psalms. It's a journaling type of devotional for the book of Psalms. And what I've done with each chapter of the book of Psalms, and then every section of Psalm 119 is written just a brief thought that has come to me from that particular psalm. It's not an exhaustive exegesis of the psalm or study of the psalm of any nature. It's just a thought. But the idea is to enable you to read the psalm, think about some of the verses there, and write down your own thoughts. And you can pick up these books. Here's a copy of Volume 1. It's called Journey in Psalms. I'm the author of that. And you can get this on Amazon, okay? You can get them through me here at our church if you want to, but it's a lot easier just get them through Amazon. They'll send them to you. There's 3 volumes, and Volume 1, Volume 2, and Volume 3. Volume 1 covers the first 60 chapters of the book of Psalms, so if you want to start there. But let's look at Psalm chapter number 2. Now, we've already looked at it, so I'm just going to give you a brief review of what we've already considered. But in Psalm 2, it says, "Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed. Let us break their bands asunder and cast away their cords from us." Now, the date and the authorship of this psalm is not really certain, and we don't know exactly when it is, but the Jews do attribute it to David during the time in which he was king. That is possible, but not absolutely provable. The idea seems to be written at a time when Jerusalem was being threatened by a confederacy of hostile powers. It seems, again, to indicate from the context of the psalm that these allies had been tributary monarchs, and now they're seeking to throw off Jerusalem from ruling over their nation and act independently. And so there's a lot in there that we looked at to begin with. But another thing to remember is this is also what we call a messianic psalm, a psalm that talks about the coming of Jesus Christ. The psalmist begins talking about an earthly king and his wars with other kings of the earth, but the words are really too great to give all their meaning to an earthly king and to be totally exhausted there. The Jews recognized this as a messianic psalm for many decades until the advent of Christ and the church, and when Christians began pointing to this psalm as a messianic psalm, as one that talked about Christ. In Acts chapter 4 and verse number 25, we have these words from Peter said, "Who by the mouth of thy servant David has said, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? The kings of the earth stood up, and the rulers gathered together against the Lord and against his Christ. For of a truth against thy holy child Jesus, whom thou hast anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate with the Gentiles and the people of Israel were gathered together for to do whatsoever thy hand and thy counsel determined before to be done." Now, Peter refers to this in his preaching and tells us that it is a reference to Jesus Christ. And so we see it is a messianic psalm in that capacity. In the first 3 verses, we find the rebellion of the heathen. And now we're going to take it in a spiritual way, but the question is asked, why do the heathen rage? And in other words, for what reason, for what purpose? In the literal setting, opposition to the king there is unreasonable. But when we take it further, I mean, opposition against God is absolutely absurd. And Psalms 2 takes a look at a world against the Lord and against his might. And over again, there have been times when the world has tried to get itself against God and in those capacities there. But you see, rebellion against God always comes from the heart. Notice the psalm says, the people imagine a vain thing. They think about it and meditate about vain things there. And so we know that the rebellion of man comes from in the heart of man, and rebellion is always foolish. Man, in all of his madness and his folly, can never imagine a more vain thing than when he thinks that he can break the bands of God's law, cast away the cords of God's love, and at the same time enjoy liberty and prosperity. You just cannot do that. God's dominion is over the world, and it does not depend upon man's acceptance of it. When one rebels against God's authority, they open themselves to the destructive temptations of the devil. Now, that's what we looked at in the first session, and you can go back and find that psalm and review those things. But today I want us to look at verse 4 and 5, okay? Notice as we read, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh, the Lord shall have them in derision. Then shall he speak unto them in his wrath, and vex them in his sore displeasure. So what I want to talk about in these two verses and from these two verses is the ridicule and the rebuke of God. The scene changes from earth to heaven. On earth, those who would rebel against God rush about, with a hatred and defiant self-confidence, plotting against God. They're kind of like a bunch of ants swarming over a broken anthill. God sees all of this, sees man running around, doing all the things that he does. The Bible says he laughs. It's interesting. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. This is not the only time this thought is brought out in the Bible. Psalm 37, verse 12 to 15. If you have an open Bible, Psalm 37, verse 12 to 15. The wicked plotteth against the just, and gnashed upon him with his teeth. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeth that his day is coming. The wicked have drawn out the sword, and have bent their bow to cast down the poor and needy, and to slay such as are of upright conversation. Their sword shall enter into their own heart, and their bows shall be broken. Notice again the combination that God has them in derision. He laughs, and he sees their day of judgment coming. Psalm 59, verses 6 through 8. Psalm 59, verses 6 to 8. They return at evening. They make a noise like a dog, and go round about the city. Behold, they belch out with their mouths. Swords are in their lips. For who, say they, doth hear? But thou, O Lord, shalt laugh at them. Thou shalt have all the heathen in derision. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse number 26. The Bible says, God speaking here, I will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your fear cometh. Now that verse is preceded by those verses that talk about people not willing to listen to God and a time in which God will laugh at them. All these words are the same. God laughs. God has them in derision. And so we see this. He says, he that sitteth in the heavens, verse number 4. The one that is enthroned in heaven is what he's talking about here. This is none other than the Lord. It's the Hebrew word Adonai, which is an emphatic form for a sovereign. All right. Here it is used only as a proper name of God. All right. Psalm 135 and verse 6. Whatsoever the Lord pleased, that he did in heaven and in earth, in the seas, and all deep places. You see, man has a tendency to propose, God disposes. It's amazing how many people claim to worship God and then go about making life's decisions without even considering God. It's more amazing to me how these same individuals do not consider, they do not think, they do not know that if the plans we are making are contrary to the sovereign will of God, they will not succeed. Now, they may bring momentary pleasure, they may bring fleeting fame, they may even bring vanishing fortunes, but they will not bring true happiness. They will not bring true joy that comes by fulfilling the will of God. Now, in this passage, these verses, we see the divine contempt of God. He that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. God doesn't need to rise up off his throne. He sits in tranquility. The rage of a tumultuous people can no more hinder God in the fulfillment of his purposes than the howlings of a dog can stop the moon from shining at night. So what can we say about this image of God laughing? Well, it reveals to us how absolutely ludicrous it is to rebel against God. The rebellion of man is so utterly groundless and hopeless that it can only be called absurd, okay? So we see the divine contempt. Then we see the divine ridicule. He shall have them in derision. In other words, God is going to bring their counsel to nothing, and he will baffle their purposes. You and I need to submit to God's what it's talking about there. Then we see the divine displeasure. Then shall he speak to them in his wrath and vex them in his sore displeasure. You see, there's a marked change from verses 4 to 5. Verse 5 is like the rolling of thunder and is more dramatic given the quiet nature of verse number 4. You see, God now, or God's laughter now passes into the utterances of his wrath and at the time that God determines. Somebody once said this: the wheels of God's justice may turn slowly, but they do turn. You see, from the book of Psalms written by Alexander Maclaren, he says, there is a point known to God alone when he perceives that the fullness of time has come and the opposition must be ended. By long drawn out, gentle patience, he has sought to win obedience, but the moment arrives when retribution wakes at the right moment. Then does he speak in his wrath. In considering this, we see the two sides of the nature of God. Here, the Bible speaks of God as laughing, and yet in the New Testament, we read of Jesus weeping. And when he was come near, he beheld the city, that is Jerusalem, and he wept over it. There's no contradiction here. Now may be a time of Christ weeping over those who rebel, but someday will be a time when God will sit and will judge those who rebelled against him. So what is all this telling me today? It's telling me that I need to consider my life. First of all, are my plans consistent with the will of God? Am I seeking to do what he wants to? Or am I living in a way that says, I am doing my own thing? I am going my own way. Well, when man does that, God sits in the heavens and he laughs. Christ weeps, if you will. But someday, God will rise from his throne and God will speak to them in his wrath. Today is a day of grace. And I don't know who may be listening to this, but I challenge you to examine your life and ask yourself, am I living according to the plan and to the will of God, or am I going seeking my own way? May God bless you. Thank you for listening today.